Hi, everybody. I'm Deacon Dave.
Layperson Lisa,
Welcome
welcome
to
to the
the
Deacon
Deacon
Dave
Dave
and
and
Layperson
Layperson
Lisa
Lisa show.
show.
And we're continuing on in the Spiritual Mentors program. And this is our class for October. And we're going to talk about grief.
Yeah.
And grief is something that we all experience, Lisa. And so I think it'll be a lively discussion when we get to the class. Well, so what are the books that we had for this particular class?
Well, they're both by H. Norman Wright. The first one is Experiencing Grief, and the second one is Recovering from Losses in Life.
Yes. And so hopefully you were able to read both of these books prior to our class and prior to this video that we're doing related to this class. Okay.
Hmm.
So I think it's interesting enough. I was talking to someone yesterday about loss and
Hmm.
about grief. And I think one of the main things is we can even experience grief before someone dies.
Well, grief is not just strictly about death. There's
Right.
so many areas that we do grieve in life, but I think typically people, when you say I'm grieving, people automatically think it is due to a death.
Right, which is the primary way that we experience grief, right? It could be the loss of a job,
Yeah.
the loss of a relationship, the loss of a family member, and I think, can you think of any other ones?
A loss of health. Like if you had maybe you have
Yep.
some sort of new mobility issue, that's a loss. A loss of a pet, a loss of a home, loss of friends, like in retirement, loss of a place to go each day.
Wow. And I
That's
think
like it's so prevalent in
no,
daily life, but people strictly, I think, automatically go to death.
right, and I think we can also worry about things, which was the point I was going to get to was that we can worry about a future grief,
Yes,
and we're actually beginning to grieve before it even happens.
yes, and
And
it may not even.
yeah, like as you're approaching retirement, as your pet is becoming aged, or your family member has been put into a nursing home,
Hmm.
that the grief process actually starts before the actual loss. But if we're not careful, right, that grief, okay, can rob us of the time that we have left with that person.
Yes,
And
yes.
so I think one of the lessons that I've learned over the last several years, Lisa, is that we have to stay present. Yes, there's practical things that we have to do and take care of with any circumstance. But if we become overwhelmed by those as a
Hmm.
result of grief, we are losing out on that opportunity,
Hmm.
right, to continue to appreciate and experience life with that person in the here and now.
I think we can even generalize that as far as worry and anxiety.
Yeah.
Because if we are worrying about what we have to do in 2 weeks, then we're not focusing on the present. We're not focusing in the people who are around us in the present moment. And so I think any sort of thing that causes worry or anxiety can can rob us of that.
No, you're right. And so one of the things we'll do during the class is we'll ask you some questions. And one of those questions, and I think we should just go through all three of these
Okay.
questions, is can you think of a loss in your life that you didn't experience as a loss at the time it happened?
Hmm.
Now, I would actually say that that person is my Granny Reeves because, I mean, obviously I knew that I physically lost her, but I have realized as time has gone on, um, how amazing of a person that she is.
Hmm.
And so while the loss is greater in my mind because she's not present physically in light of my new understanding of who she is in a more powerful way, she's supernaturally present through the power of God in my life and in my heart and in everything that I know of her. And those experiences are now heightened. What about you?
Um, I
Nope.
can't think of anything.
That's okay. What about, can you describe a loss in your life that you've never fully grieved over? Kind
No.
of, right. So I think,
But we have seen people that maybe when there is a death of a family member that they make themselves so busy and they don't give themselves room to grieve.
that's what I was going to say. You're actually in denial, right?
Yes,
So instead of
yes.
actively entering into this process with God, right, who is going to journey with you during the grieving process, we try to put it on the back burner.
Yes.
We try to focus on everything else we can possibly focus on. And honestly, it just doesn't work. I mean, if you think about someone that's doing that, they're carrying this weight with them.
Mhm.
Okay. So they're not really functioning as they should be. And it's still something that eventually
Will
they're
hit
going,
them.
yeah, that they're
It's just
going to
like
have to deal with.
burying things, right? Like when you bury things, eventually you think you're dealing with it, but you're not, and eventually they're just gonna
You're
come
dealing
in.
with it just not in the right way.
Yes, exactly.
And I actually talked about this with someone yesterday. We were talking about how uh, if you have something that happens that you need to process,
Hmm.
if you bury it, there's going to be triggers later on that unbury it.
Yes.
And so not dealing with it is actually not spiritually healthy for us
Sure.
because it has effects on us that we're not even necessarily aware of. Does that
Hmm.
make sense?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think even processing trauma and things that have happened and loss maybe in war
Hmm.
or loss in some tragic way
Hmm.
that we just don't want to think about it because we feel like it's just going to draw emotions out of us. And what we need to deal with is the objective truth of who God is,
Yes.
right? And the hope that He's given us. And while, yeah, the circumstances around the loss of any person can be not what they should have been and can cause us great difficulty, the Lord wants us to keep our eyes not on the injustice, but on Him
Right.
who is justice
Right.
Himself.
Right. Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, God always wants us to focus on Him no matter what we're experiencing or what we're going through. And sometimes I think, like, when you are going through some sort of loss, that you can have a distracted gaze and focus on the loss and the feelings, that the sadness, the loneliness, or whatever the feelings may be, instead of focusing on God and like celebrating the experiences instead of focusing on what is no longer.
So as we are continuing on now, we actually just needed to check to make sure that
You could hear.
that you could actually hear us. Otherwise, we would have talked for 30 minutes and you would have been like, we can't hear a thing you're saying. For those of you that can read lips, it would have been perfectly fine though. So what are some of the aspects of loss, Lisa?
Well, life is a blending of both loss and gain,
Hmm.
and we seem to handle losses best when they are infrequent. It's like where sports comes in. Like sports, like you tend to lose.
A lot.
Oh, it just depends, right? There's loss and there's wins, and I think it's reflective of life, right? There's wins and there's losses in the general aspect of life.
And I think this is interesting that we actually have losses that we're not grieving over because we don't recognize them as being a loss.
Yeah.
I think a good example of that is someone who's retiring.
Yes.
And so in some ways they feel like they've lost their purpose, which
Yes.
isn't true. Okay. But they've lost what they've always done.
Right.
And so now they're forced to find new avenues and it's a different season of their life. And yet they're kind of struggling with that, but they're actually grieving.
No, they are, because there is a loss of seeing the same people each day,
Hmm.
and maybe that was a comfortable space, and now each day is more of a challenge because you don't have to be at a set place at a certain time for a certain amount of hours. And yeah, there's definitely loss there.
I also think there's a perceived loss.
Yes, perceived. Yes,
That's
yes.
not something that needs to be grieved over, but actually needs to be redirected back to Jesus,
Hmm.
right? Because I think oftentimes people will find their purpose in the things that they're doing, for example, and when those things are taken away from them for whatever reason, they lose their purpose.
Yeah.
Another way to think about it is someone who's doing just fine, and then all of a sudden they are struck down by some sort of illness
Yes.
that has permanency to it.
Yeah.
And so now everything that you thought you were, your job, the things you do, the activities, the stuff you do at church, all of it's taken away.
Hmm.
And now you find yourself in a bed,
Yeah.
right? And so you struggle with your identity, which we've talked about. You struggle with your purpose. You struggle with the why. All of these are signs of grieving.
Sure.
Okay. But you need to recognize that that's what it is because the person who accompanies us through grief is Jesus himself.
Yes.
but so often I think you would agree when we talk to people, that's not at the forefront of their mind.
Right.
It's everything else surrounding that
Right.
instead of dealing with, okay, God has permitted this to happen. And so how is God going to use me in this situation to bring him glory and to draw myself closer to him and to maybe through whatever it is to draw others closer?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Right, because that's ultimately our purpose. But a lot of people think our purpose is related to what we actually physically do, or
Right.
where we go each day.
And I think the other thing about loss is that it helps us to grow
Yes,
spiritually.
to rely on God.
Exactly, right? So we begin to also understand the deeper meaning of our losses and to be able to, as we've been talking about, be redirected by those losses to who we really need.
Hmm.
So one of the questions that we're going to ask you, okay, what are some losses a mentee might bring to spiritual mentoring? And I think we've
We've
talked about,
mentioned quite a few.
and trust me, people, you have to be able to recognize it as a loss.
Yes.
You have to be able to recognize it as something that they're grieving over, okay, what used to be,
Hmm.
to the loss of a family member and everything
Hmm.
in between.
I think one that we didn't mention that is quite common is like when a son or daughter leaves the house either for college or leaves and gets
Yeah.
married. I
Hmm.
think that one can cause loss and grief.
Oh, there's no doubt. Both of those
Yes.
are great
Yes.
examples because there's like this significant change. People who are empty nesters,
Hmm.
when their last child moves out, it's
Hmm.
like, okay,
Now what?
everything that I built my life around
Yeah.
is no longer available to me. And I think what's interesting about this is, I mean, we're all going to experience grief. We're all going to experience loss. We're all going to die,
Hmm.
right? And I think part of the question is that God is constantly preparing us because he already knows what's going to happen in our lives. And so we need to be ongoing attentive to how God is trying to speak into our lives to form who we are as he seeks to draw us closer to him. And in drawing us closer to him, he's also preparing us for what he knows is coming in our life.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, what about secondary losses?
What is a secondary loss?
Are you asking
Yes.
me or the
Yes.
audience?
Well,
Or is it a
yes.
rhetorical question that you're not going to
I
answer for yourself?
would like to know the answer.
Well, so I think it says here every lesser loss that is experienced compounds the overall feeling of a loss in a person. So, like you have your family members that move out, so you actually lost the fact that your son and your daughter are now off to college.
Okay.
Well, a secondary loss of that is like, okay, well, now I no longer have anybody to take care of.
Okay.
I no longer have anyone to talk to. I have a loss of purpose.
Okay.
What am I going to do with this time that I used to spend doing this? Right. And so those, I believe, are what one would call
Secondary.
secondary
Okay.
losses. It's like when you lose a family member, okay, there's the loss of that family member, but there's the loss of everything that goes along with that. The
Yes.
things you did with that, the
Yes.
conversations, the
Even
phone
like
calls.
friends,
Yeah.
like maybe you
Yeah.
did like had a group of friends that was like couples or whatever. When your spouse passes, then you kind of feel like that those friendships may be lost as
And we
well.
know someone like that, right? We're not going to mention their name,
Right. Right.
but that is a great example. So yeah, you have to pay attention to all of the associated losses that are a result of whatever the main loss is. And so
Mm.
you might have to like process through all of these things
Yeah.
with people as you sit down to talk to them. What were you going to
Yeah.
say?
You may maybe that would be something you would ask them to write down
Hmm.
as well, like journal about like, okay, so this primary loss, how what are the secondary losses that are coming from it? Because it like the last slide said, it like cascades.
Hmm. And yeah, identity
Hmm.
as a secondary
Yeah,
loss,
yeah,
right? Whoever you, and we've been talking about this for the last 10 minutes, whoever you thought you were, right, by that loss is now gone.
hmm
And that's why it's so important for us to find our identity
Jesus.
in Jesus. Because if we do that and not situations or not people, then we're going to be much better off, right, when that loss comes, whether expected or unexpectedly.
Yes.
So to what extent does every loss impact our identity? I think we've already talked about that.
Mhm.
So, and I'm reading some questions on the from our presentation. Who are we when we are no longer defined by the person or thing that we lost? And I think this actually is not just related to grief. Okay, because I've talked to people who their entire marriages, which we talked about last month, okay, were found in their spouse
Sure.
and what their spouse thought about them, and or they leaned into their spouse and they weren't leaning into Jesus.
Hmm.
So when that spouse either passed away, or in some cases that spouse, there was a divorce or something different that happened, that person no longer knew who they were
Yes.
because everything about their world was revolved around that person.
Yes.
Everything about our world needs to be revolved around Jesus.
Yes.
Right? So how do we overcome losing a role we once identified with?
I think maybe we ask Jesus to reveal to us where he's calling us now in this moment and just be open to what he reveals to us and not focus on the past because that's where the devil wants us to be.
Yeah, focusing on the past is not going to be helpful, but I think ultimately how we overcome losing a role we once identified with is recognizing that we have a permanent role in Christ.
Yeah.
Right? As baptized people, okay, we are sons and daughters of the Father. Okay, we're heirs to the kingdom, and at the end of the day, there's nothing of this world that changes that. And so ultimately, when we start to see our identity and who we are inside of that framework, then we are much better able to deal with the losses that come along in life.
We're able to deal with everything.
Okay, fair enough. You're right. We're able to deal with everything, people.
More effectively.
Exactly. But I think the thing is we can be in like the super greatest relationship with God,
Mhm.
and we're still going to grieve.
Mhm.
It is
Jesus did when Lazarus died.
yeah, it's a part of our human nature. It's a part of what we're going to go through, and it can help us to grow if, as we have said, if we enter into it properly and we invite Jesus into it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So we talked about a loss of identity. We've kind of been talking about this for the last few minutes, and we'll talk about this in the class too. So from the why to the how, there's a 4-step process for adjusting to most types of loss. So do you want to talk about those?
Sure. The first one is to change your relationship with who or what was lost. Find new ways of relating to the loss, whether it's a person, a job, a home, an ability, or something else.
So what do you think that means? Finding a new way to relate to the loss.
I think maybe, like we've been mentioning, like don't focus on what once was, but focus on Jesus and where he's calling or how he's calling you to understand the loss.
Yeah, I think that I was obviously ready to step away from the company that I owned.
Mm-hmm.
Debbie, my wife, is struggling with that a little bit more because there's going to be all of these perceived losses of being needed, being valued, being in control of what's going on, financial. There are all of these things. And one of the new ways of relating to that loss of ownership is new opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that new opportunity has been the retreat center.
Mm-hmm.
And so and the retreat center is a focus on God,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's actually something that has been born out of us selling the company and then redirected in a very positive way towards God.
Mm-hmm.
So I like transitioned the day I sold the company. I had no problem.
Yeah.
Debbie is now in her 4th year and is actually saying things like, okay, I'm starting
to
detach. And
Yeah.
that's a key thing, right?
Yeah.
Because if we stay attached to the wrong things, it's not spiritually healthy.
The only thing we're called to be attached to is Jesus.
Amen, sister. So what's the next one?
Develop your own self and your life to encompass and reflect the changes that occurred because of the loss.
And I think that's And I think you have to embrace, right?
Yes. Like
What
new
is
opportunities, like you said.
yes, and new situations, and sometimes it's obviously can be difficult,
Sometimes we're just so caught up in the comfort
right?
of
Hmm.
the what we have lost that we so many people are just so uncomfortable with change. People are uncomfortable with not being comfortable. And I know like that's what kind of was my delay in changing jobs. When I got a new job offer, I hated the job, but like I was really good at it. I knew the systems well. I was comfortable, but and so I was like, well, do I want to go to a new place that may be a better opportunity, but I may be uncomfortable.
Exactly. And so when certain losses happen that are out of our control, okay, we don't have a choice. And so, we have to find new ways of functioning,
Yes.
without whatever has been lost.
Right.
And then the fourth thing is discovering new directions for the emotional investments we once had in that object, that person, or that situation. And the retreat center is a good example of all of these
Hmm.
because I've been able to refocus my energies. Because a lot of people, they keep working
Yeah.
because they don't know what they're going to do, or they
Right.
fear that I'm going to be sitting around all day. And it's not, I hear this
That's me.
all the time, but it's true. They're
Right.
like, well, what am I going to do?
Right.
I'm not going to have any purpose. I'm going to be sitting home. I'm going to get inside my head, or I'm going to waste away. But if we are listening to God as we approach, these times in our lives, He will begin to unveil. And this goes back to our very first class on prayer,
Hmm.
right? Where if we're in a prayer relationship with God, He will constantly be in one way or another directing us, okay, and helping us to discern His will as we
Hmm.
move forward.
Yes.
And I don't think, honestly, a lot of times we involve God in the decision making of what we're doing or where we're going
Right.
for a loss that's planned, which is a job,
Right. Right.
or a loss that's unexpected, or grieving that starts before that. We don't get God involved in a way that we should.
Mm-hmm.
And God is the very key of us doing that. Okay. So grief is the reflection of the connection that has been lost. Okay. We think we want to avoid the grief, but really it is the pain of the loss that we want to avoid. Grief is actually the healing process that actually brings us comfort from the pain.
Hmm.
Yeah. So when you bury it, it's going to come back up,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you may have delayed it, but it may come back with greater vengeance, right? Than it did before. I mean, does that make sense to you?
It makes me think of the Beatitude, like blessed are those who mourn.
Right. For they will be comforted.
Yes.
And I think part of like our grieving, and I say this in funerals all the time, Lisa, that our grief is a sign of how much we've been loved.
Hmm.
And so this natural response to loss is not a bad thing in many cases,
Hmm.
especially when you've lost someone.
Hmm.
It's literally like, okay. And even like when you lose your children, right? Because they've gone off to live their own lives.
Yeah.
If you and so that hurts. But if you really think about it, well, isn't that what you raised them
Right.
for?
Right.
Isn't that what they're supposed to be doing?
Right.
Hello?
Yeah.
It's like, but we like get caught up in ourselves at that point and how we no longer have them.
Right.
When all the while when we had them, we were going, you know what? I just want him to grow up. I want him to be successful. I
Yeah.
want him to have a good life.
Right.
And we forget about that.
Right. Well, it just makes me think how in this slide it says how we want to avoid pain
Hmm.
and how we create these false selves that are self-protective
Hmm.
and they're turned inward,
Hmm.
like what we're the false self is like more selfish tendency, so like, well, how could my child leave me, like you said, but like, hey, you raised them for this, like this is what you desired for them. And so like we have to turn outward, like, okay, Lord, like we thank you for like the person that my son or daughter has become, and we can focus on their new life and be excited for them instead of our own like sadness that they're no longer in the home.
Yeah, and it's kind of made me think about something. a lot of times when we see other people that are hurting because of choices they've made, we hurt and we grieve because of the loss of the life we know they could have. Maybe they're suffering from an addiction. Maybe they're making a lot of bad choices, right? And so you can actually be grieving over that. And enabling actually only increases the pain
Mm-hmm.
that we're experiencing
Right.
instead of doing the hard thing, which is to detach
Right.
and to actually, okay, you know what? I'm going to have to, that's to me, I never thought about this until right now. That one of the things is that we might have to grieve is not doing so much what we want to do, trying to help someone who's not willing to help themselves.
Right.
And so we hold on
Mm-hmm.
and we enable, and it's just like staying up on the cross, inflicting more pain because we fear the alternative.
Yeah. Well, I think enabling is also dangerous because in the case of like say addiction, like someone that you care about is asking for money, and like you want to give them money because they need food, right? But
Yeah.
ultimately, really, what are they paying using that money for? They're probably paying for their addiction,
Hmm.
and like that could have more severe consequences than having a kind of maybe thorn in the relationship.
No, it can become very
But we have a
complex.
whole class on addiction.
Well, and but it's like
But there is mourning involved. Yeah. Right.
there
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
and there is suffering and
Yes, a lot
grief
of
that
suffering.
and hurt and pain that goes along with that.
Yeah. Are
Um,
mourning and grief the same?
mourning and grief. I would think so.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I never really thought about
Yeah.
that, but I don't know why they would.
Yeah. Blessed are those who grieve. That would be.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so.
Yeah.
So one of the questions in our presentation is to come up with an image that characterizes an experience of grief.
Mm-hmm.
And so uh, I think some people know this, but a lot of people don't know this. My grandmother Portress was we're pretty sure murdered, and we found her in a power easement behind a park in Henderson, North Carolina. And I remember that when they found her, I was looking in that area and I got a phone call saying, "Hey, we found her," and she was passed away. I just like I remember being by this big tree and just falling on the ground and weeping. And I said, I think that's like an image of grief was just being under that tree by myself and just bawling
Mm-hmm.
at the loss of my grandmother because there was so much attached and associated around that. What about you, Lisa?
Well, I just think of like a storm. And maybe I'm just so I don't know word pictures. I don't know. I think of a storm, and like sometimes we sit in the storm and we just don't want to, I don't know, open the door. But no, that's not right. So like if there's a storm, but like in the end, what beauty comes from the storm is the rainbow.
Yep.
And so like we just focus on the hope that Jesus gives us instead of the the feelings that we may encounter during these times.
Yeah. So one of the things on our presentation it says grief is like a wave. It comes rolling in from a far off place. I cannot fight the wave. It moved over me, under me, and broke against me. That's kind of like you can't avoid it,
Mm-hmm. Right.
right?
Right.
That's a good analogy. I like that too. Um, so there's a lot of interesting stuff on here that we're not gonna. Although this is really interesting, right? Too. Um, there's a lot of emotions, and we all know that the devil loves to play inside of our emotions that might be attached to any sort of grieving that we're going through. And I think that's why it's so important for us to to keep our eyes on the objective truth, who is Jesus,
Right.
and not on the other stuff. And like just looking at some of the words, which ones up here on the screen that our listening audience can't hear really jump out here.
Um, I'm looking for one in particular that I do not.
I see rejection.
Yeah.
and I see loneliness.
Yeah. Yeah. Loneliness. I was thinking hopelessness,
Hmm.
but I don't see that on there.
Abandonment.
Abandonment, despair, emptiness,
Hmm.
sorrow,
Right. Anguish.
anguish. Yeah. Sadness.
Yeah, apathy. That's dangerous, right? It's like I just don't care anymore.
Ah.
That's kind of like the apathy is sort of like
Indifference.
hopelessness. Yeah, it's apathy is almost like hopelessness,
Oh,
I would
okay.
say.
Well, they have despair on there, so yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah, so you have all of these uh, emotions, and be for sure, as we've talked about spiritual warfare, okay, that the demons that are prowling about the world seeking the ruin of souls will want to disorder the grieving process,
Yeah.
where God wants you to know that, right, and this is heard in a lot of funerals. It's like, okay, this momentary affliction has given way to a weight of eternal glory,
Mm,
right? So everything that we go through in life is nothing compared to the eternal glory, that we're going to
oh,
experience
sure. Yeah.
for forever and ever.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think you can get caught up in any one of these little things that you just mentioned, right? And it can totally distract us from our eternal hope.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's always the danger, right?
Yes.
In all of this. So it's important that we do, put our feelings and our thoughts into words and give them shape and meaning. Because so often, I think when I talk to people, they don't have shape and meaning. Just yesterday, we were talking to someone, and when you start looking at all of the things that they have going on, right? That is, if you remember our healing class, okay, the retreat that we did, there's all of this fruit that's manifested that's not good fruit.
Right. A riot fruit.
And right. And so in order for us to, and we mentioned some of those on the last slide, we need to give these things meaning.
Right.
What are you thinking?
No, I do think that sometimes you just try to bury things and not deal with them. And so putting feelings and thoughts into words gives you time to process and to accept maybe how you're feeling and, be able to continue forward.
It's funny because this whole feeling thing has been coming up in both of our readings,
Yeah.
right? In our time
Yeah.
with God. And this question is, why would having a mentee think metaphorically about their grief or dealing directly with the meaning of their grief be more beneficial than simply asking them how they feel,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of times it's like, well, how is this making you feel?
Well, right. And yesterday, when we were talking to somebody, you stopped because you were about to ask that question
Right.
and you rephrased it in a way, like you changed it into what are you experiencing? Because yes, the emotions are what really the devil uses to manipulate us and to manipulate us into areas of pain and despair. And like you said, we're just called to call on the objective truth of his God.
Yeah. And so grief is a tangled ball of emotions, or it can be.
Yes.
And the devil's counting them. So
Yes.
our range of feelings is like a smorgasbord. And we could have a wide variety of things to choose from, as we have discussed. Okay. And these things might even change from day to day.
Yes.
Okay. They'll come and go, and they might even overlap, but it's no wonder, okay, that there's a lot of confusion with all these jumbled feelings that we have that might be associated.
Oh yeah.
And God doesn't want us to be confused in that way.
Right. Right.
I mean, I think grief is an opportunity, as we have said, to really lean into God in a real way. Very, very important. Okay. So let's talk about some of the facets of grief, because I think these are important when you're not going to sit down with somebody in one
And
session.
be like,
Congrats.
it's slow.
Yes.
It's a journey.
Yeah. And it can be painful,
Yes.
right? You got to go through levels of denial. And I think we've all experienced, right, that we are kind of rejecting the reality of what has happened and how we need to move forward. And I like this third one.
It's a journey across unknown terrain.
Yes. And
Well, I think it's unique for every person.
it is, and every situation is different.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
not like you do them over and over again.
Yes.
And because if you've lost a person to death, each person in your relationship with them is different.
Yes.
And so how you're going to deal with that is going to be different.
Sure.
Every child, you have a different relationship with it. And as they leave or they get married, the loss and the change that comes along with that is completely
Very.
unique.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
I do believe that there are, however, a general set of guidelines,
Okay.
which all revolve around a deeper, more intimate relationship with Jesus
Sure.
and our prayer life,
Okay.
that will help us to invite Jesus in much quicker and to be able to recognize and name what's going on inside of us, right? So that we can allow Jesus to really deal with it. Did that make sense?
Well, yeah, it's all about the intimacy with him.
Right.
And the more time we spend and invite him into the grief, then the more the more healing that we may receive.
Right. And grief is certainly disruptive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whatever we have going on in life, when something happens, it really changes what's going on in our life. And even long after, right, we may have these moments where grief is reintroduced. And I just experienced this with someone yesterday who, I think was making good progress, but has had a momentary setback. And I think the important thing to do is to keep your eyes focused on God and not focused on the fact that you're experiencing emotions or things that are hurtful inside of you because of the loss. Right. And so it's like, okay, let me reorient myself. Add oriental back to God. And while grief is universal, it's different for every one of us. So I think just because you're talking to one person in spiritual mentoring who's grieving, and y'all may talk to a few things and there may be a few realizations, do not go, oh, well, I can apply this to the next one.
Right.
Because it don't work that way.
Well, it's that everything is spiritual mentorship.
Exactly. That's very, very true. Okay, so let's talk about the actual stages of grief, Lisa.
Shock and denial. So there's a state of disbelief and numbness.
Yeah. How about pain and guilt?
Mm-hmm.
You may feel that the loss is unbearable and you're making other people's lives harder because of your feelings and your needs.
Mm-hmm.
So this is interesting, right? It's like doubling down.
Mm-hmm.
So not only are you suffering from some loss, you are feeling guilty because you know it's having an effect on other people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then anger and bargaining. So that may cause you to lash out, or telling God that you'll do anything that he asks if only you are allowed relief from the feelings or situation.
Right. And I think so when you have someone that is dealing with someone that has a long-term disease like Alzheimer's, I mean, you could be in a really super lengthy grieving process.
Sure.
Because you are grieving the incremental loss of that person
Mm-hmm.
as whatever it is affecting them and slowly taking away who they are.
Yeah.
Right? And then, they pass away. Then there's that. Then there's so grief can be like a really long thing depending on the situation,
Sure.
right? And if we're not careful, it could lead to depression, right?
Right.
And we'll feel isolated and lonely. I mean, you could have a spouse that you're taking care of and feel completely isolated and lonely because they no longer know who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you had for 20, 30, 40 years has been stripped away and your complete energy is going towards them, yet you feel completely isolated and lonely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's grief.
Yeah. Because I think you're also grieving not only for your loved one, but you're also grieving for what the life you used to live.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because that's a loss. And once again, these are like secondary losses, right?
Yeah.
That are associated with this. And at some point, there's an upward turn. Okay. That as we kind of get through these things with Jesus, that we become more calm, more relaxed. And I think it's really important that Jesus has to be involved in this process in order for it to be sustainable.
Yeah.
I mean, you hear the saying, time heals all wounds. Okay, that's fine. But so does Jesus, right? And he's one.
Yeah, but time, I think, like we've been talking about, if you bury things,
right,
like 50 years could pass.
Right.
But like we talked to somebody yesterday about that, and then it was never what did we say? Resolved? No,
No, yeah, it was never resolved. It was
yeah,
reconciled to God.
there was no yeah, it was never, and none of that was ever reconciled to God. So now it's just coming out, after being dormant for so long.
Yeah, so time, as you're suggesting, okay, it may feel like it's healing the wounds, but it's scabbing it over.
Yeah.
And anything might open the wound back up.
Yes. Yes.
Where Jesus will bring permanent healing
Yes.
to us, help put us back together and moving forward in a very gradual way, accepting everything that's happened and maintaining our hope as we move forward in that, Lisa.
Yes.
Okay. So we talked about a lot of these.
Yes.
Okay. We're looking at some common losses. Okay. But in this case, it's looking at them through the lens of the stages. So if you have a breakup or a divorce, right?
Okay.
The first thing you're just like, I can't believe this happened.
Yes.
No, they're not going to leave me.
Right.
The shock and denial, right?
Right.
And then you might go, well, what did I do wrong?
Right. Like
What?
blame yourself.
Oh gosh, I hear this all the time.
Right.
Okay. And if you don't think grief is a process, walk with someone whose spouse has left them that they really loved. And you will see that grief is I'm going to say maybe a 5-year process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, maybe there's anger and bargaining. What can I do differently? Maybe if I do this, they'll come back.
Right.
And then finally you're at home by yourself. And it's been 2 years or 3 years. And it's like, what am I doing?
Mm-hmm.
What is my purpose?
Mm-hmm.
I'm in this big house by myself,
Right.
right? And then eventually, I think through spiritual direction, through prayer, through intimacy with God, you can begin to have that upward turn.
Yes.
What are your thoughts? Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. Yes.
So I actually, I don't necessarily think about these stages when I'm talking with people, but having these stages put in front of me and then reflecting on people that I've talked to in the past, I can see every single one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So do you think people come, yeah, I guess people do come at different stages, because I do feel like people have come when they're in denial of grieving. But I think sometimes the real healing can't come until they're ready to
Yeah.
move forward.
Yeah, and you're right. I think if someone's coming to you, number one, let's give God thanks and praise for that, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a recognition there that there's some things that they need to talk through and say out loud. And it's like they realize, okay, I can't do this on my own, but I'm not really sure how to do it. So I'm going to go talk to someone. And then that's where, you like, okay, let me talk to you about this person that you already know. His name is Jesus, right? And so in many cases with people that are grieving, it's like reconnecting them in a deeper, more intimate way so that God can tell them who they are, because this whole identity thing plays out, who they thought they were, what their life was going to look like. All the stuff we've been talking about, that all comes into play in a real way.
Oh yeah.
When someone shows up.
Oh yeah.
And I've had people that are waffling between pain and guilt and anger, right? One minute they're asking themselves, what did I do wrong? And the next minute they're like, I don't ever want to see this person again. I'm so angry at what they've done.
Yeah.
And then they'll jump back over to, well, I must have done something wrong, right? And this really hurts that I've lost this. And so you'll see these kind of things happening, okay? So what I'm doing now is we actually we did it impromptu, right? Yeah. But this is like giving a little example, which is nice for that, which is still ongoing apparently. Oops, let me go back. Okay. That's just telling us something about something in the book, which we'll cover during class. Okay. And I kind of like this picture. This is a picture of a root system, right? And then it finally sprouts up. So it says, think about why grief for you specifically. Has it grown you? If so, how? If not, what is hindering? All right. I think in a spiritual life, Lisa, anything that we are going through, where we know that we are struggling inside of our soul, is an opportunity for us to meet Jesus in that place, or have him meet us in that place, so that he can minister to us like we've been talking about,
Mhm.
and that he can give us what we need, okay, comfort us,
Mhm.
but also guide and direct us, okay, to the real meaning of all of this, and how he's calling us to some greater place in him. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. Well, no, I think like everything that we talk about as far as spiritual mentorship, the foundation is Jesus.
Hmm.
The way to help people is to allow them to, or encourage them to focus on their relationship with Jesus. Because sometimes we see people that, will say they're too busy to spend quality time with Jesus, and they come see us, time after time with the same exact thing. And until they realize, or they are willing to dedicate time to spending with Jesus, then it's just gonna snowball.
Exactly. Exactly. So, any closing thoughts, Lisa, for you?
No.
Very good. That was very succinct. Thank you.
Well, I just gave my closing thought.
I thought it was excellent. I thought it was excellent. Well, I am Deacon Dave,
Person,
and
Lisa.
we will see you for the next class.